You look at our state legislature and who are the fiscal conservatives these days? It's some of the Republicans, sure, but the hardliners, I mean, we just saw them try to pass a budget that had $1 billion deficit when we have $130 a barrel oil. I've never seen anything like that.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. Today on the show, we have Alaska attorney and former chief of staff to Governor Bill Walker, Scott Kendall. Mr. Kendall recently represented Alaska Redistricting Board members Melanie Banky and Nicole Borromeo in action against the Alaska Redistricting Board itself. Today, we talk about all the recent Alaska Redistricting Board news, as well as his specific involvement. We also discuss his childhood and the evolution of his conservative politics to where he stands today. Scott Kendall, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is great.
So you got involved with redistricting recently. So I want to talk a little bit about the redistricting process. For listeners who don't follow that, can you talk a little bit about what redistricting is and what it's supposed to be?
Yeah, so redistricting is this decennial, every 10-year process that we have to go through because we have to redraw the lines for our House and Senate districts. And the reason for that's pretty simple is one person, one vote assumes that your vote has equal weight. And so if population changes and one House district, for example, has twice the population of another House district, that smaller House district, those voters have twice the vote. And you never get it perfect, but basically it's a rebalancing. Now that's, I guess, in an ideal world, what it's supposed to be. A pure rebalancing, keep together communities, geographic communities, communities of interest, keep them together. And, what it's turned into nationally, and a little bit here is, what we know as gerrymandering, which is how do we carve this map up either to put these two incumbents together so we knock one off, or do what's called cracking and packing, which in a large sense is you could take a map that's, literally 50% one way, 50% the other way, and if you carve the map the right way by packing your opposition party into districts at very high concentrations, you can take over 80% of the map, even though you only have 50% of the vote. And so that's what happens. But what it's really supposed to be is just a rebalancing of population. That's it.
Right. And every state does it differently. Mm-hmm. Some states have their legislatures do it. In Alaska, we have the Alaska Redistricting Board.
Right.
And it is a group of 5. And I'll just kind of run through how it works. The governor gets to choose 2.
Correct.
So in this most recent redistricting board, that would have been Bethany Markham from Eagle River, mm-hmm. and Bud Simpson from Juneau. Mm-hmm. And then you have the Senate president, who at the time that the selection was being made was Kathy Giessel, who chose John Binkley.
Yeah.
Who went on to be the chair of Correct. The redistricting board. Yeah. And then the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time, which was Bolger.
Joel Bolger. Mm-hmm.
He chose Melanie Banky from Nome.
Correct.
And then the final member was Nicole Borromeo from Anchorage.
Yeah, she lives in Anchorage.
And she was chosen by Bryce Etchman, who was Speaker of the House.
Correct.
So what I'd like to do to kind of give listeners a flavor for what was expected of this redistricting board is play Kathy Giessel speaking about her choice of John Binkley in July 2021 on Jeff Landfield's podcast, The Alaskan Landmine.
The critically important thing to me is, are you focused on a fair map? And John certainly said that. So did Bud Simpson. He was someone else that I was considering appointing, but I can only appoint one. But Bud also said he's very interested in a legally defensible map that's fair. And I told John, and of course at that time I didn't know whether I would be still in the Senate or not, but I said, under no circumstances would you think about preserving my seat. Mm-hmm. I just want a fair map.
That's interesting to listen to because, and just so our listeners know, Senator Kathy Giesel lost her seat. She was primaried from the right in her district.
Yeah, exactly.
And she lost her seat to Holland.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, if you want to call it from the right, I mean, I know Kathy. I like Kathy. She's pretty darn conservative. She's a conservative's conservative. And I think, I mean, if I were armchair analyzing, and I guess I am, I'd say she was primaried for lack of obedience, right? You know, she wasn't towing the line to the governor, to her party leaders. She was acting plenty conservative from my perspective. She was being fiscally conservative. But, you know, I think they said, you're not paying out $7,000 dividends, you're out. I don't see that as conservative, but I think you're right that she was primaried.
Well, either way, when she made the choice of John Binkley, she was choosing someone that she felt was going to act in the spirit of what the Alaska Redistricting Board was created to do, which is to be a nonpartisan group of people who are going to create fair districts that are one person, one vote.
Right.
Did that happen?
I think eventually it happened, but, you know, here we are on the other side of, you know, essentially 4 rounds of litigation. But I would say, you know, in defense of her pick of him, and even to some degree in the defense of the pick of Bud Simpson, I know these people. I've had dinner with them. I've spoken with them. On paper at the time, I think John Binkley was a fine choice. You know, he had represented Bethel in the state Senate. He's from Fairbanks. He's got that broader view, and a lot of people think, you know, Republicans from Fairbanks, from places outside of South Central, are a little different. They're a little less party obedient. So I could see he and Bud on paper being quite fine choices. And it was just kind of really unfortunate how it unfolded, because if you look at it, I think people largely felt rural Alaska was treated well in the process. The House districts on a close vote came out very fairly. You know, the House districts really barely got adjusted by the courts. And then it came to the Senate pairing issue, and the whole thing exploded. And, you know, and again, kind of going back to the way people are appointed, we all kind of know how they're appointed, which is people pick political allies, so to speak. In the Constitution, it says people are supposed to be picked, you know, without regard for their political affiliation. And so it's really unfortunate that at the end, it really, really looked like a partisan process for those last couple of rounds on the Senate pairing issue in particular.
Right. So for our listeners, Bethany Markham, John Binkley, and Bud Simpson are Republicans.
Right.
Nicole Borromeo and Melanie Benke are nonpartisan. They also happen to be Alaska Native women. Melanie Benke was a guest on our podcast back in December. She is vocally not a Democrat.
Right.
So I think one of the things that's kind of unfortunate about this whole process is the way it's been portrayed and publicized is that it was Democrats against Republicans, when really it was 3 Republicans against 2 nonpartisan women who weren't seeking to do any packing and cracking. So it's important to note that the House map was approved by a vote of 3. Melanie Benke, Nicole Borromeo, and Bud Simpson. Bud Simpson was the swing vote in that case.
Right.
They had a lot of public debate. People saw that process. They saw the vote happen. The initial Senate pairing happened at an extraordinarily accelerated rate, where there was just a couple of days from that House map and the Senate map being approved. That initial Senate map, initial Senate pairing paired South Eagle River with South Muldoon, and North Eagle River with Jay-Bear and downtown. And so that was challenged in court.
Right.
By the East Anchorage plaintiffs.
Right.
And so that case was ruled unconstitutional.
There was a couple of things there. And again, you know, someday, or, you know, 6 months from now, a year from now, we'll get the full 50-page Supreme Court decision. But what they seem to gesture at is, you know, equal protection and just overt gerrymandering. So overtly trying to manipulate the map for political gain. people can, there are subtle ways you can nudge a map, of course. But I think people looked at the attempt to take Eagle River, which is very strongly conservative. That's their identity. They're even talking about seceding from Anchorage and using them because they're so top-heavy with conservative votes to flip 2 seats. I mean, at the end of the day, that was the target. And yet, even when you got testimony from people in Eagle River, they're like, we want Eagle River to be with Eagle River. I mean, it makes sense. Would I want to be, as I sit here, would I want to be paired with Eagle River from where I sit here in Sand Lake or with Campbell Lake area? It only makes sense. My kids go to the same schools. We shop at the same cars down the street. And instead, they were taking people kind of across the mountain. And it was...
because the goal was for Eagle River to have 2 senators.
And it wasn't even that, right? It was to flip 2 seats. Because in a real sense, if you live in Eagle River and you just want to be represented the best representation you're going to get is the person produced by your unified seats. Now, if you are in Eagle River and you want someone wildly conservative, if you spread them out on 2 seats like that, you might end up with a more moderate conservative. Maybe you don't want that. So Eagle River also, that was sort of minimized, that Eagle River has a role to play in this too, where they're like, maybe we want, I know Laura Reinbold's not running again, but maybe that's who they want to elect, and they wouldn't have been able to in this split map. So it was really, there's 2 aspects to it. You're diluting Eagle River's vote, their pure vote, and then you're just sort of drowning the votes in Muldoon. Now, if Muldoon say it's a swing seat, say it's 55-45 Democrat, and I'm making up numbers right now, but the Eagle River part is 80-20 Republican, clearly that's just a tidal wave that's going to swallow them, and their representation is going to be Eagle River-centric. That's not fair to them, and to some degree that's not fair to Eagle River because you're diluting what they really want.
Well, one argument that Bethany Markham made on the record is that she wasn't trying to increase Eagle River's representation in any way. That actually, by dividing Muldoon into what at one time was actually 3 different sections, that she was giving Muldoon 3 senators.
Right.
What's wrong with that argument?
I mean, what's wrong with that argument is who do they represent, right? You might nominally have 3 senators, but if they answer to 80% of their vote coming from across the mountains, they're not going to listen to you or your problems. I mean, that's the cynical view. You'd hope any public servant would say, hey, I serve my entire district, but that's the realistic view is, it's the same reason we have the Electoral College to some degree. If we didn't have the Electoral College, who would care about Alaska's, 500,000 votes? No one would care. But we have 3 electoral votes. It's that same argument of you have to give some rootedness to a district. And so, if you go down that path, and there was some wild discussions on the record where I think at one point some of the board were even saying, do we even need the Senate districts to touch? Which was, to me was bonkers. So, I mean, that's the issue. If you're spreading, you could chop my neighborhood into 3. This neighborhood that we're sitting in right now, and you could have 3 different House districts touch it, but we wouldn't have any representation because the 300 voters who live here, we would be 100 in each of these districts and no one would care. So, I mean, that's the problem, is when you slice people that way. And the problem with what Miss Markham said is, of course, prior to saying that, she said she actually wanted to increase Eagle River's representation. And that's that's sort of
the smoking gun.
It was the quiet part out loud that I think the courts rightly seized on is, well, you said pretty transparently what you were going to do, and lo and behold, then you did it.
Right. And so they sent the redistricting board back to work. They needed to find new pairings that did not break Muldoon up. That was the instructions.
That was the message they took. And I will say that the orders were less than clear, right? Because they talked about communities of interest. They talked about political gerrymandering. But, what was missing, I think, in that initial decision was they should have said, by the way, Eagle River is a community of interest too. Keep them together. Because that's kind of the missing part about how we all analyze this is, to some degree, the people in Eagle River were being abused for their vote. We want their vote. It's a powerful vote. We want to spread it out around the city. A lot of the testimony I heard from prior representatives, from Senator Reinbold herself, was, on what planet does that make sense? Eagle River almost perfectly makes two House seats. Why wouldn't you put those together as a Senate pairing? It makes no sense not to do that.
I know the testimony that you're talking about with Laura Reinbold. I'll just say that I heard it within the context that she was going to be in a race with Kathy Giesel, Roger Holland, and herself. Like that it was going to be three of them, two incumbents plus Kathy Giesel in a ranked choice vote election where with that kind of district, I feel like the advantage would probably go to Giesel.
It's sort of a who knows thing, but I mean, that goes back to my prior point of if Eagle River is a community of interest, and I think they are, their kids go to the same schools, they're in the same watershed, which is in the Constitution, they shop at the same Fred Meyer. If what that group of people predominantly wants is Laura Reinbold, that's what they should get. They shouldn't have their vote diluted where they get a Roger Holland or a Kathy Giesel. And so to some degree, they were kind of being abused by this process as well.
Right. So the redistricting board met again, and one way of doing that would have been to pair North Muldoon with South Muldoon, North Eagle River with South Eagle River, South Anchorage with South Anchorage, downtown with downtown. Basically, put the pieces together.
Right.
They did not do that.
Right.
They created a new split for Eagle River. North Eagle River with J-Bear and downtown, South Eagle River with Hillside, Girdwood, Portage.
Right.
Way out there.
Right. Which, to me, you might say it's less politically troubling because maybe that's a center-right district and there's less minority community. And that was some of the really serious issues with Muldoon is it's a very diverse area and you were pairing them with a non-diverse area. But this one geographically was even more laughable. Just look at a map, right? If I live in Girdwood, I'm driving through 8 other House seats in order to get to the other half of my Senate district. I mean, the only thing connecting them was the Crow Pass Trail. And I've done it once, and I don't think people do it commonly to go get their groceries. So, I mean, it was this sort of laughable, it would be like connecting Turnagain to a rural district across Cook Inlet, like connecting us to the Dillingham district. Do technically the districts touch? Well, technically, but there's, 400 miles and no people and 2 mountain ranges in between. It was just, it was silly is what it was. And it was them, to some degree what was disappointing was they were a bit thumbing their nose at the court. Oh, you don't like that? How about this?
Right. And there was a new lawsuit brought by 3 litigants in Girdwood.
Right.
Question for you, the lawyer. What if Girdwood hadn't done that? Would this not have happened? I mean, would we have been stuck with that map?
You have to have a live challenge. So there's people who have pointed to other parts of the map they don't like. There's some Fairbanks issues and other issues, and it's, the courts don't drop out of the sky like a SWAT team and, change something. Someone has to assert their rights before those rights get litigated. So I think if the Girdwood plaintiffs hadn't shown up, that would have been the map.
Interesting. Well, one thing that was different this time around was that there was a lot of public testimony.
Right.
Because that was kind of one of the problems that the court had addressed earlier was there really wasn't time for public comment on the Senate pairings. So they went above and beyond to have multiple days of testimony and really draw it out. And they had a vote 3-2. The 3 Republicans against the 2 nonpartisans in favor of this new map with the, continued Eagle River split.
Right.
This case came forward, and this is the part where I'm kind of inferring a lot, but there had been this litigation committee created, which was John Binkley with Bud Simpson. Bud Simpson is an attorney. There had been some arguments back last year about this litigation committee having Nicole Borromeo, who's also an attorney on it, but obviously 3-2, it became
back in December.
Binkley and Simpson. There were complaints from the 2 nonpartisan members of the board that the litigation committee was making decisions for the board that the board was not a part of.
Right.
And that was not what the litigation committee should be doing. Do you have any opinion on that, or can you talk about that?
Well, yeah, I do. And, obviously full disclosure, I worked with Nicole and Melanie on this issue, consider them both friends, admire them a great deal. But, trying to take that hat off and kind of put on my neutral lawyer hat, this is the problem, which is you can't delegate, under the Constitution alone, you can't delegate that level of power to a litigation committee. You could hold hearings with one board member, two board members. You could probably make ministerial decisions. But when you came to a decision that affected the validity of a map or which map to use, that has to be, under the Constitution, it says 3 board members have to act for any such decision. And what they were doing was saying, we've been told to use a different map by the court, which becomes the new status quo, right? Judge Matthews says, do this. That's the new status quo until you appeal. And they were deciding to appeal without checking in with the rest of the board. What was weird, or let's say atypical or contradictory, was when they lost the first case in Superior Court, they did meet as a board. They ratified appealing. That was a 3-2 vote again, but they took the vote. That was important. Here, you had 2 board members who were saying, what's the update? What's going on? What are we going to do? What are we holding a meeting? Refuse to hold a meeting. We're going to appeal. What do you mean we're going to appeal? We didn't vote on this. Let's hold a hearing. Let's hold a meeting. Let's, have a public meeting, take the vote. That doesn't happen. Instead, they get told, here's our brief, we appealed. And so that was so procedurally backwards. There's 2 problems with it. One, either, they couldn't and didn't delegate that kind of power to the litigation committee, and the Constitution says they couldn't. The second problem with that was, if the 3 of them got together off to the side and decided that was the game plan, that's Open Meetings Act violation. That's in its own way, maybe a bigger problem, and any action taken in that way is voidable.
Well, devil's advocate, if they were meeting, chances are that Ms. Markham is going to vote with Binkley and Simpson on every issue. So they would have their 3 votes. So really the only thing missing was things happening in public so that we could hear what's happening.
But that's, I'll play devil's advocate right back at you and say that's incredibly important. So imagine, here's an analogy, the legislature, right? I'm Scott Kendall. I'm Speaker of the House. I have 30 people in my caucus. We have a majority. We can do whatever we want. I don't get to go and say, this legislation is passed. I don't get to do that. What do? I go into the House, I go on the floor, I have the debate, and very importantly, the minority gets to make its case against what I want. Maybe they change minds, maybe they don't. If I've got that many votes, they don't have a chance in hell of stopping me, but you go through the process. We always have that process. So that's important. That's why this exists. That's why they have public meetings. That's why we can watch them online. That's why we can do public testimony. And so that was, such a serious defect that I think tacitly the board even admitted that, because they weren't available for meetings for the next 10 days. What do you know? They pulled a meeting together in less than 24 hours.
That's a really good analogy. So thank you for that. I want to play a short clip of Nicole bringing a friendly amendment to the board. This was, they were taking a vote, I think, to approve their challenge to the Supreme Court. I mean, I guess to appeal the Superior Court decision to the Supreme Court. Okay. And so Nicole wanted to make a friendly amendment, in part, I think, because of being left out of the process.
Right.
Whichever way is accepted to the majority of the board. If the majority feels so strongly about this appeal, I think that they should pay for it personally, or they should ask Nat and his firm to dedicate their time on this portion of our work pro bono.
And you're suggesting that to Bethany as a friendly amendment?
Yes, as a friendly amendment to allow her amendment to go forward to support the litigation, provided it's no longer paid for by Alaskans. We're over $1 million in right now.
Yeah, okay. I think we get it.
I'm not done. I'm not done, and you may not get it. When we
then why don't you make a motion, and then we can
John,
have discussion on the motion.
That friendly amendment made a lot of sense.
Right.
If this what appears to be another gerrymander, being appealed to the Supreme Court is going to be paid for by Alaskans. We're paying to defend what, to a lot of us who've been watching closely, looks like an illegal pairing. Why should we have to pay for it? So I don't know if you can comment a little bit about that friendly amendment being brought up, or if that's happened before, or if that's possible.
Well, I mean, she makes a good point, right? For all people who tried to portray Nicole and Melanie as partisans, they're not. I know them. They're not. They're nonpartisans. I myself am nonpartisan. I could take a position on an issue and not be a flaming liberal or not be a hardcore conservative. That's possible. And they were just trying to be Alaskans about it. And, not for nothing, they batted 1,000. Every time they raised their hand and said, we're going to get sued and we're going to lose, we got sued and we lost. And so I think they made the very valid point of, you guys are playing with house money. You're gambling with someone else's money. You believe this, put up or shut up. If our attorney believes this, then, put it on the table. Now, we all know that wasn't going to pass, but I see her point, saying, 40% of this board thinks we're out to lunch on taking this appeal. Maybe you guys should, put some skin in the game. It clearly wasn't going to pass, but I think it made a really sound point, which was, if they had not done these pairings or gone down this path with the pairings issue, this would have been a phenomenally successful redistricting process. Like they moved, one minor map adjustment, the Cantwell issue. Like, that's it. Like, they could have been heroes where 99.99% of their maps were upheld, and then this pairing issue just took them off the rails. And I think you saw that, right? Because they were working on this for over a year. We didn't hear about these board fights throughout the process. In fact, they were holding more public hearings than any board before them. Like, they were running, to credit them a bit, they were running a state-of-the-art, transparent process right up there until we got to this point on the Senate pairings, and then it just got weird. And I think, that's Nicole just kind of standing up for common sense. Like, we lost on this once, we're going to do it again, really? We're going to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars taking another appeal that, they lost in 72 hours. And it wasn't a close call. It was a unanimous 5-0 Supreme Court decision. That court is a nonpartisan court. 2 of those justices were appointed by Governor Dunleavy. This wasn't a close call. So why are we here where we are? So I think while, her motion had zero chance of passing, I think the logic in her raising it made sense.
And one reason why I played it is because I wanted listeners to hear how contentious the relationship had become between the two factions of the board, and how far astray it sounds like Kathy Giesel's appointment to the board has moved. I mean, I will say, full disclosure, I testified at redistricting. John Binkley was incredibly kind and polite to me. So, on a personal note, he was very kind and polite when I testified strongly against these pairings.
Yeah, I will say the same thing, that at the time Kathy made that selection, and to be fair, at the time Governor Dunleavy selected Bud Simpson, again, I know both of them. Reasonable, thinking, caring Alaskans, very polite. I've had meals with these people. And I think what we saw, I don't want to speculate about outside influences on this process, but what we saw with the 2 of them, I don't think was representative of either man. I don't think we saw them at their best, which is unfortunate, because I think John Binkley's given a lot to the state as a businessman, as a state senator. And unfortunately, we see this happen with a lot of public figures here. It's sort of like the flavor of national politics infects our local politics. And it's just not the way we do things. And whenever we try to do things that way, it just goes wrong.
Can you explain how you were approached by Nicole and Melanie, and what your role was as far as representing them against the board? Were you representing them against the board, or just a little bit about that? What your complaint was?
Yeah, without getting into privileged communications, because they are my clients, but what's a matter of public record, what we filed is what we filed. which is, I've known, particularly Nicole, I've known for years and years. I know Melanie a bit. I was an admirer of theirs, all sorts of work. Nicole's done incredible work on the census, for example, through AFN.
What is AFN?
Alaska Federation of Natives.
Okay.
And people may not realize, but my partner, John Elizabeth, and I had actually represented AFN in some litigation against the governor on the power cost equalization. So we had a very good relationship. And at a certain point, she realized she couldn't even get legal updates from her own counsel, let alone advice. Because, the board's counsel has to do what 3 out of 5, in his defense. When 3 out of 5 of your client tell you what to do, you got to do it. That's
Matt Singer.
But you do have a duty of transparency and communication with the other 2. You just do. And there was a point at which they felt like they had been utterly frozen out. And I think a breaking point came when they said, I found out that we had appealed to the Supreme Court on Twitter. I'm the client. What the hell's going on? And I think that was the point at which we looked at it, and I think correctly, and analyzed, this isn't even a lawful appeal. And we became very concerned about curing that, because what happens if the Supreme Court looks at this and says, we can't even look at this? Does that more delay? What happens?
Mm-hmm.
There was an argument to be made that, well, maybe they didn't appeal in time then. Now they went back and they cured it, and that was important. The process, with Nicole and Melanie, and myself as well, I'll put myself in that bucket, the process is important. The vote's the vote, 3-2. I will say, that 3-2 vote they lost, well, they won 5-0 at the Supreme Court every time, so that, they can count to 5.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that was the process, which was they needed someone to turn to who understood these issues. They needed independent counsel that would walk through, because they literally could not get legal advice from their own counsel.
And was you guys' appeal, or I don't know the right word for it, lawsuit, thrown out by the Supreme Court, or what?
It was resolved. So we filed a filing, which was highly, I'll be the first to say, we were trying to figure out, okay, you've got to get this on the record. How do we get it on the record? Because can you file a response to your own party's submission, which really the Girdwood plaintiffs would have had a right to object to. They could have said, you guys don't get 2 bites at the apple.
Mm-hmm.
What are you guys doing? But at the same time, it was an important issue. This may not be a valid appeal. Read the Constitution. And to the Supreme Court's credit, the Supreme Court said, hold on. We're stopping everything until and unless you update us on what's going on with this. And then when the Supreme Court said, hey, we don't need your filing, they said, because this was ratified, we don't need to consider this issue. So I think everyone acted appropriately. We raised the fire alarm. They retroactively fixed it, whatever you think about them being able to call a meeting on 12 hours notice. But there was a process, right? Nicole and Melanie got their chance, so to speak, just like that House Speaker analogy. They got to go on the floor. The minority perspective was put forward. They lost the vote, and then the lawsuit had what I would have said is a predictable outcome. I was asked my opinion, and I said 90% or more that they're going to lose, because they have literally just done, again, the thing they did before. And not only did they do it before, but they created a record where they said, we have bad motives doing this. The Bethany Markham testimony of, I'm doing this to expand Eagle River's influence.
Eagle River has its own 2 separate House districts. This actually gives Eagle River the opportunity to have more representation. So they're certainly not going to be disenfranchised by this process.
And when you say that out loud, it probably would have been thrown out without that. But it's sort of, the fruit of the poisonous tree. That bell could never be unrung.
Mm-hmm.
And when that was the motivation, and you watch the contortions to do... there are layers to how you can analyze this, right? You can analyze it geographically or otherwise, but just like when you look at it, Eagle River makes a Senate seat quite neatly. It doesn't pass the red face test to say, let's split them apart. That's where it all falls down, and all the justifications and the public testimony kind of get silly at that point.
Hey guys, it's me, Corey, with the Mid-Podcast Spot, and I just want to...
Now hold on just 1 minute. I thought I was the star of these here spots.
Oh yeah, Spirit of Alaska. And Polaris the Eagle. I didn't think you were in today. You seemed really busy and all.
It's true. Being the Spirit of Alaska comes with great responsibilities, but I always take a little time to talk to my fans.
Oh yeah, I get it. But as the sound guy, I don't often get to say anything important around here.
You just wanted a little time in the spotlight. I get it. I'll tell you what, it's important to share and to give to those around you that work hard. For example, when I care about someone, I introduce them to the East Anchorage Book Club podcast. Not only does it enrich their lives, but it also supports the podcast. So go ahead. The mid-podcast spot is all yours today.
I mean, you just said to share the podcast, and that's the point of the mid-podcast spot? You know what? Thanks, Spirit of Alaska.
Always glad to help.
When the Supreme Court's verdict came out this past week, for those of us who are not lawyers, when we read the conclusion, I literally had to go to a journalist and read their newspaper article. I was like, a stay? I don't know what that means. I mean, which side won? You know,
Right.
what's happening here? Can you explain what the Supreme Court's verdict was and what it will mean moving forward?
Yeah, and don't feel bad about that because, you know, it is a truncated decision where they don't have time to explain their reasoning, first of all. Second of all, I can say I talked to more than one journalist who said, I don't understand this. Can you explain it to me? Which I was happy to do. And so here was the problem. You know, the Supreme Court sent it back with pretty specific instructions. They did the same thing again. And the courts aren't supposed to, quote unquote, pick a map, right? But what they did have was they had a record where there was two maps that the board put forward for consideration. Presumably the board saying these are two possibilities. And they were forced because of time to say, you have to choose that other map for the interim map. Now, the other part of their decision was, ultimately the board is supposed to finish its process and actually choose, quote-unquote, a map. And what they should do in reality is just choose the map they've already approved. But the Supreme Court put a stay on that process. And they said, hold on, don't commence with the rest of your process. And what I believe they're saying there is, we're going to write a full decision. And you're going to know exactly, we're going to give you a roadmap of what you need to consider, what you can do and what you can't do before you finish this process. Because I think the last thing the Supreme Court wants is, you know, next January to get another bogus map, have to throw it out again. I think they want the board, to the board's credit, to have the benefit of their full reasoning. And then the board can start that process up. Now what they should do, what would be safest, adopt a map that's already Supreme Court blessed, right? Mm-hmm. But what's in contention is very small, right? The House lines are locked. The Senate pairings everywhere but Anchorage are locked. And so is there some other way they can kind of move pairings around? You know, mathematically, theoretically there is, but there's really not many other ways it makes sense, right? If you were to subscribe to the thought that they were moving the pairings in order to gain a political advantage, there's not many other ways to move the lines around that will give them that advantage. So it's almost like everyone should just say fair is fair, the game's over, let's adopt this map. But that's where we're at, is the Supreme Court has said, use this map, Plan 2, and don't do any further process for finalizing beyond this year's election until you read our full decision.
Got it. So they could still meet and potentially choose different Senate pairings prior to the election in November. But the election in November must use map 2,
right?
The map that...
Right, and that stay on further proceedings, I think, was the court saying, don't try to finalize a different map until you see our decision.
Okay.
And that's sort of the status quo.
So there isn't really any time pressure. Since we have to use map 2 for November, they could choose to meet and discuss this in December. It wouldn't really matter.
It wouldn't matter, except that, you know, then you're on the, you know, there's a process again and litigation again. And if you move lines around, did you just take out a bunch of new incumbents and force people to run again? I could see a way in which it could create a whole big mess again.
Like, that's the other thing I wonder is when people got selected for the redistricting board, did they know it was going to take up multiple years of their lives?
Yeah, precisely. It's you know, they've been on a whole journey, and I hope they kind of, you know, because again, as you said about John Binkley and Bud Simpson, these are kind, good people. They have families in the state. They care about the state. Whatever the influences were that took them down this path, like, this doesn't have to define anyone's life. Like, you know, I hope that they get along with Melanie and Nicole. I mean, these are all smart people who are passionate about the state. Like, find a way to move forward after this. It's very unfortunate. And I think what was unique about Melanie and Nicole is they were perfectly willing to share their real-time perceptions of what was going on the record. And I don't think people had kind of seen that before. And I thought it was great. It was great for the public to see and hear, kind of the quiet parts out loud. So the upshot of this entire process is we had an incredibly transparent process. There's been new case law made, equal protection, communities of interest. We're likely to get a Supreme Court decision that I think is, if I'm guessing, it's going to be far more protective of what's supposed to be a nonpartisan process.
Good. And speaking of nonpartisan, you do not come from a nonpartisan family, Scott Kendall.
No. I grew up on a farm in Western Washington and Sequim, Washington. As we were talking before we started here today, like generationally farmers, 500 years of farmers, as near as we can tell, back to Germany, Ukraine, come to the U.S., farmed the Dakotas, and as a lot of, very, very blue-collar, salt-of-the-earth type people tend to have pretty conservative viewpoints. I also grew up, my own background. I lived in a very small town, 2,000-something people. I knew 2 African Americans growing up. That's all. I knew quite a few migrant workers because I would work on the berry farms and the apple orchards with them. But pretty sheltered, Grew up as a typical kid from one of those places, believed I'd never met a gay person. I'm sure I had, but in my farming town, I think it's fair to say I was like a young kind of redneck kid. I wasn't racist, but I was homophobic. I was kind of I wouldn't have a lot in common with my 19-year-old self. Let's say that. So very conservative people. Older brother's a cop. I wanted to be a cop, which isn't to say that's necessarily politically conservative, but just sort of like looking for ways to serve in that way.
Which was the first presidential election you voted in?
I'm trying to remember. I believe it would have been the Clinton re-elect. So Bob Dole versus Clinton.
And you voted for Dole?
I voted against Clinton, yeah.
Yeah, for
sure.
Sure.
And, and for what it's worth, as I sit here today, I would have voted to impeach Bill Clinton. He had an affair with a young woman. He demonized her, and then he lied about it under oath. I would have voted to impeach Donald Trump too. I mean, I think there's just certain standards for things, but that's where I was at the time. And I mean, I guess I could even go further. I'm probably a rare person. I voted for Obama in 2008. I voted for Mitt Romney in 2012.
Well, let's go there. So why did you decide not to vote for Obama the second time?
In my mind, one, I like Mitt Romney a lot. I still do. I think he's an honest person. He has his own background. He has his own, but he has a bundle of issues where I think he's pretty moderate. It's sort of weird to sit here today and think, one cycle ago, he was the Republican nominee for president, because I think he looks very different than Republican politics writ large now. So, I mean, if I were sitting here and I was laying out a continuum, I would say Mitt Romney's a hell of a lot more like Joe Biden than he is like Donald Trump, just because the metrics have changed. So I thought Obama had real opportunities and huge majorities to do major things, and to my mind, didn't do them. Mm-hmm. I find him to be an inspiring speaker. I think his personal story is amazing. But I thought he had not done what he could do to help the economy and on some other things. When, you got 60 votes, you can do anything in the world. Why aren't you doing them?
So really fast about Mitt Romney, he marched in the George Floyd protests, some things that other Republicans didn't do. I'm just thinking he voted to impeach Donald Trump. I mean, I think those are two things that just spring to my mind where he really went against party
Right. Oh, and full disclosure, I should rewind a little. So I'm an attorney and I work in politics. And I was actually, it didn't amount to much, but I was Mitt Romney's Alaska State Counsel for his campaign.
Okay.
And so I'd be on conference calls with him. I don't pretend like we were friends or anything, but I always sort of, more of the Mitt Romney you see now, I think was there under the surface. And as he was running, people they were kind of seeing a guy who, when I saw him on TV, was very stiff. Mm-hmm. I'd be on a call with him. He'd be hilarious. He'd be affable, very common sense. And then, maybe the national stage, you kind of stiffen up. I'm not sure, but I think the Mitt Romney we see now doing those things, regardless of politics, saying right is right and wrong is wrong, that's the guy I voted for. That was why.
So let's go back. So you did not become a police officer.
I did not.
So you graduated from high school in Western Washington and then went to college, I assume?
Yeah, I mean, and I could digress a little bit, but pretty rough childhood. My father was I tend to identify more with, people ask why I work on different projects I do or different things I do, and I identify more with people who don't seem to be white middle-aged attorneys like me because it was a fairly rough childhood. My ACEs score is an 8. My father was.
What does that mean?
Adverse childhood experiences.
Okay.
It's sort of and 10 is the most. And I never really thought about it. I had a conversation with Val Davidson one day, and we were just talking. We were on a long drive together, and I realized, geez,
Well, I'm going to say that we are sitting in your library right now, and I see a couple of books, Jewish literacy, Jewish wisdom. Are you Jewish?
Yes.
I'm going to just express my own stereotypes that for me, I don't think of the typical Jewish person as growing up in a tough childhood in a super conservative home, growing up to be cops. Like, that just doesn't fit, like, my stereotypical trajectory.
Yeah, it's a weird, and so I guess that's another digression. I come by my Jewishness sort of backwardsly, because it's a part of my genetic heritage, but it's something it was from my father's side of the family. Although, interestingly, my wife's family is Jewish, and, David Guttenberg is her uncle. He's named David after his uncle David, who was a cop killed in the line of duty. So there's more of there's a lot of stereotypes about Jewish people, but there's much more blue-collar background than you'd expect. But that's, again, a digression. My father was of Jewish descent, but I disavowed it. He was sort of a-religious. He didn't. And my mother was Lutheran and tried to raise me Lutheran, which didn't go well. And in some sects of Jewishness, you're not considered Jewish unless your mother was Jewish. It's matrilineal. I met my wife, we practice, and it wasn't really important to me. And then my wife became pregnant with my daughter. I converted, not because I needed to convert, because I was of Jewish descent, but because I wanted to be as Jewish as my daughter, my family, which is...
But you hadn't grown up in the synagogue. You
not
didn't
at all.
have
not at all.
bar mitzvah.
No, not practicing, not anything. Like I said, my mom tried to raise me Lutheran, and I was raised, my father left when I was 11 or 12. My grandmother had me, and they're of German, Ukrainian descent, Lutherans, very strong Lutheran, and they did their best. It didn't stick, I can say that.
How do they feel about you being Jewish now?
Well, my grandmother passed away, but interestingly, because both of my siblings, my 2 older siblings, married Catholics, she had more issues with them marrying Catholics than me being Jewish or marrying a Jew, because I guess the Catholic Lutheran, I guess going back to Martin Luther, I guess the hostility between Catholics and Lutherans is still really strong. But they didn't really, I think they were glad, because I was a very lost kid, that I had found something. I think that they embraced that, because I was while I was apparently very bright, I barely got out of high school. And the only reason I graduated from high school is because, horrible issues with my father. He left. We were briefly homeless because he got us evicted out of our house on purpose. We lived in my grandmother's basement. I'd kind of given up. I probably went to school 1 or 2 days a week. I was truant. I'd run around. And I can't remember if it was sophomore or junior year in high school. I took the SATs, and I got a nearly perfect score. and the principal took me to his office. I thought I was getting expelled. I didn't know why. And he said, "This is embarrassing. I don't know where the world failed you, but you're going to graduate." He said, "I know you don't show up for school, but I've talked to all your teachers. You're going to graduate." And my math teacher was so angry. He said, "I have to give you a D. And I'm so mad because you don't show up, you don't do anything." But they graduated me, so I couldn't get into any university. So I went to...
Even with almost perfect, like a 1,500 or something?
Yeah, I mean, my grades were that bad.
Wow.
So I graduated, quote unquote. And so I was actually, the National Merit Scholars. I probably have like a world record on the shortest National Merit Scholar. So I got a letter from the National Merit Scholars. "You're a National Merit Scholar. Congratulations." 10 days later, they're like, "No, you're not." They sent me another letter because they had gotten my transcript from my school, which was, it was a brief run, and I didn't even know what it meant at the time. But
So how did you become an attorney?
So I went to Peninsula College in Port Angeles, Washington. It is not a top 10 school. You might imagine it's not a top 100 school in the state of Washington. It's a very blue collar. They take everyone. So, I would go and I would save up my money and I'd pay $400 a quarter to go there, and went there and got my associate's degree. Took a year off to save money. Got into Western Washington University, so a Division II school, a little bit better in Bellingham, Washington. Then my mother got cancer, so I dropped out of school for about a year and a half. I lived with her, worked on cars. And that was a great, actually, one of kind of the transformational moments in my life, which was... I had had a taste of actually being in school, even though I worked 2 to 3 jobs while I was in university. I had a taste of that, and then I was working on cars. And not that I didn't value, I met some great guys, and you're greasy all day and you're sore at the end of the day. And I realized I can do something more. And maybe my mom being sick made me realize that, I should try. And so that was the point, that was kind of the inflection point at which I went back to school to finish my bachelor's degree and really actually started working hard. My grades showed it, and that's when I was going to be a cop. I took the exams for Seattle Police Academy, was going to go in, was all set to go when I graduated, and my brother's father-in-law is a prosecutor. My brother's a cop in Spokane, Washington. His father-in-law's a prosecutor, and he literally just said, "Scott, you're a bright kid. You should just take the LSATs, see how you do, And he said, and actually, like cops who get law degrees, they get promoted faster. So I had no idea. I just literally took the LSATs kind of on a lark, and as a total digression, but to complete the story, about a week before that, I got into a bar fight and got my jaw broken. Didn't know it was broken. My face was swelling up, and went to the doctor. He's like, "I don't know what you did to your face, but this is bad." And he said, "Well, here's Vicodin, here's this, to get you through." And I'm like, "I got to take the LSATs." So he's like, "You can't take them on these drugs." So I couldn't sleep that night. I took the LSATs on no sleep, tearing off tiny pieces of a protein bar to chew in the other side of my mouth because I couldn't eat. And I got a nearly perfect score on my LSATs, which I didn't even know at the time. I didn't know what the scores meant, right? So I got a full scholarship I was going to go to Gonzaga because my brother lived in Spokane, and then I got a full scholarship to University of Washington Law School. Changed my life. So
how'd you end up in Alaska?
Got to University of Washington Law School, and it's a very small program, 120 people, and they put you in 6 different small sections, 20 people per. And weirdly, out of those 20 people, I got put in with someone I hadn't seen since elementary school who used to ride my school bus back in Sequim, Washington, and my future wife. Wow. Met her the first day of law school and never looked back. Visited Fairbanks, actually, the August after our first year of law school. I was like, that's it. That's where I'm living.
Because that's where she was from.
She's from Fairbanks, yeah, born and raised. And so I just knew I had to live in Alaska. And in fact, when we ultimately graduated, we graduated early. I didn't march in my graduation. 48 hours after taking our last final, we were on the Alcan.
Wow.
And I haven't left Alaska for more than 7 days at a time since.
So to get back to presidents, I assume you voted for George W. both times?
I did not the second time.
Okay.
So I guess I got a pretty mixed scorecard.
Kerry?
Yeah, John Kerry.
Okay, so you were George W. And why did you not vote for Bush the second time?
I was disturbed by a lot of the things going on with the war and so forth. But, I can honestly say in that election, in the Obama election, in the Obama versus Romney election. I mean, I think unlike a lot of people, I was genuinely conflicted. Like, I was like, this is a close decision for me. I want to hear what both of them have to say.
So then you've never really been a partisan political person. Like, you've never been, I am a Republican, I am committed to the Republican Party winning. It was about making the right choice.
Yeah, I mean, I had mixed. I don't know if I've ever voted a straight ticket, although I was a Republican for a very long time.
Registered,
right? Mm-hmm. Up here you get the chance to meet. Mm-hmm. I did work for Don Young. I voted for him. I think I voted against him once. I voted for him most of the time. But I had worked for him as an attorney. I had worked for Ted Stevens. So when I was a Republican, working for Ted Stevens, I felt pretty comfortable in my own skin. Ted Stevens' best friend was Daniel Inouye. I was at Ted Stevens' funeral, and Joe Biden gave the eulogy. Mm-hmm. The sitting vice president flew to Alaska to give the eulogy for his Republican friend. That was the Republican lane I was pretty darn comfortable in. And then, of course, in 2010, working for Senator Murkowski. Mm-hmm. That lane, there's clearly a lot of overlap in that lane in terms of values. It's not so stark.
Would you describe yourself as a Murkowski Republican?
Yeah, I mean, is it a Ted Stevens Republican, Murkowski Republican? I'm not a registered Republican now. I was kind of hanging in there. I ran Senator Murkowski's 2016 reelect, and then immediately after that, I went to work for Governor Walker
as his chief of staff.
As his chief of staff, and I can tell you, as though you turned a light switch, I lost dozens and dozens of Republican friends. Can't believe you're working for that traitor, on and on and on. I knew Bill Walker to be like a good, honest man who was, trying to get his hands around the state's, precarious fiscal position. And I'm saying to these people, we had a $4 billion deficit and this guy cut it to $1 billion. Like, that sounds kind of, to me, Republican means get out of people's lives, law and order, balance your books, right? That's not obviously what a lot of Republicans do these days. You look at our state legislature and who are the fiscal conservatives these days? It's some of the Republicans, sure, but the hardliners, I mean, we just saw them try to pass a budget that had $1 billion deficit when we have $130 a barrel oil. I've never seen anything like that. So, my breakup, so to speak, with the party was finally, I remember it very well because it's my son's birthday is January 6th. And January 6th, my in-laws are here. My father-in-law and mother-in-law are here to celebrate my son's birthday.
And they're Democrats.
And they're Democrats in Fairbanks, fairly prominent ones. But we're watching turn on the TV and the Capitol riot is happening. It's my son's birthday. They're there to celebrate. And it's happening in real time. My son wanders into the room. And he reads the newspaper. I mean, he's not a typical 11, 12-year-old. He reads the newspaper. He keeps up on stuff. He had to listen to, because of Zoom and COVID, he had to hear me debate ballot measure 2 about 100 times. He can tell you all about election reform. But he asked what was going on, and I explained it to him. And he literally said, is Lisa okay? Can you text her? Is she okay? I mean, that, heartbreaking stuff. Because he knows Lisa is almost like an auntie. He sees her at the airport. She comes over, gives him a hug, So that was tough. And I had an exchange with a very prominent leader in the state Republican Party. And I said, look, man, you guys have to condemn this stuff. Like, this is happening right now. You have to condemn it. I'm not saying you have to blame the president. No one knows what's going on yet, but you got to condemn this. And they just abjectly refused. And to me, I'm like, my brother's a cop, and I'm looking on TV, and they're beating cops with flagpoles. And if you can't condemn that as an organization, if you can't condemn that action, there's a lot you can tolerate. A lot of political diversity in any party you can tolerate. I couldn't tolerate that.
Well, as we know from reporting in the last couple of months, there was debate, at least in D.C., among Republicans to condemn it. Kevin McCarthy, the recordings of him saying lots of stuff that was like, no, this is really bad.
Right. I mean, not everyone has, but I've been in those buildings. I've been in those spaces. And the thought of those people defiling them, the thought that Mike Pence was locked in a room where a mob walked by the room he's in 10 feet away. I mean,
Who would have killed him?
that was the implication, right? I mean, he was in danger. Whatever you think of how unorganized and what a motley crew of it was a bunch of goofballs and losers, but that can be dangerous.
Right.
And the fact that they broke into the building and they could not restrain them, he was in real danger. And so, there was moments of heroism and all that, but it seems as though some people who knew on that day how bad it was are trying to reverse engineer it into a protest, reverse engineer it into something it wasn't. I mean, it was what it was. It was when you have someone on TV who's willing to say these things. We've always had peaceful transfer of power because we've always had people who understood and respected the system. And when one of your leaders is willing to go on TV and break those barriers, we just saw kind of a monster unleashed.
Right. And he still has not conceded.
Yeah, not to my awareness.
So I guess to bring it back to Alaskan politics, are you working on the Walker campaign now?
I am not. I'm obviously very supportive. I've got a lot, I'm working on a lot of other political things and, just keeping the lights on as an attorney, but I'm a supporter. I'm a donor. Heidi's a dear friend. She went to high school in Fairbanks with my wife, and they had their first jobs out of law school together. They were both clerks at Fairbanks Superior Court. I mean, they are just phenomenal human beings, both Bill and Heidi. So, yeah, very supportive, but not working on the campaign per se.
Well, last question that we ask of all of our guests is to recommend a book. What book would you recommend to our listeners?
So it depends on, what you're looking for. Like, I read a continuum of stuff. I read, historical type stuff. I've actually, of late, I've gravitated away from that because I read for a living. I'm an attorney, so I go to kind of an escape. So I read some high fantasy. I read some sci-fi. I don't know if, you've ever read Patrick Rothfuss? He wrote a book. It's the first in a series called The Name of the Wind, and it's high fantasy. You got to kind of suspend your disbelief, but it's so lyrically and beautifully written that I just highly recommend. It's one of those books where you sit down and just the art of the words. It's a pleasure to read. So
what's the name of the book again?
It's called The Name of the Wind
by
Patrick Rothfuss. Rothfuss.
Very cool. Thank you so much. That's definitely our first fantasy.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
Breaking
series. Yeah. Hey, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew.
Thank you to Corey Coolidge for making this podcast listenable, and thank you to you, our listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. Next week, we have Matt Hamby and his husband, Chris Sheldon, who were the plaintiffs in Hamby versus Parnell, which legalized gay marriage in Alaska. Please tune in.